Hi guys, this is Game Geek coming to you with a video explaining the Barbarians, specifically the European Barbarian factions and how they're treated in the EDU 4.0 system. Again, we're still on the alpha, so there's some corrections yet to be made, but just wanted to highlight how we're trying to make these unique factions a bit more interesting, unique, and playable. Uh, Since traditionally a lot of these have been tier 2 or tier 3 at tier 2 at best or tier 3 in EB online play. And while history is still our ultimate goal in providing the best balance, hopefully these changes will make each faction feel a bit more unique and useful in its own way. So the ones I want to cover in this video are the Arwerni, the Idui, Casa, Suebozes, Lusotana, and the Getai. Now, the Getai are traditionally the most playable of these because of their versatility, but all of these factions in general are quite interesting. So let's start with the Gulls. So continental Celts in this new system are distinguished by a few bonuses and penalties. The main bonuses, old EB mainly used a combat bonus for barbarians. In this case, I went with a different approach that reflects a bit more how reflects history a bit more closely. So Celts have a few things going for them. They have a discount to heavy infantry, a slight discount to horses, discount to weapons costs, reflecting their metallurgy. The fact that the Celts were very renowned smiths, and there's a lot of good iron deposits in Central Europe, which they were able to draw on. And they have, I think, a very small discount to horses as well, but not by that much, reflecting the open grasslands and everything. They do have a slight increase to cost of missile skill, reflecting that they really weren't well known for their missile troops. You really only have a few options as Celts, the Osatai. They're still a solid slinger. Sling was the preferred ranged weapon of Celts besides the javelin, and these guys could hit at a decent range. And they're a little bit more resilient than other slingers, like this Fendonetai. You can see they've got much better combat abilities, and they've got superior. Fendonetai should have 6 morale, not 8. That's a mistake on my part. But they should have, they have better morale and they're able to fight a little bit better, but they cost more. So we have, but yeah, no, these are the Celts. You can see, look at their basic infantry here. Say the Botros. They have, they don't have the greatest defenses. They have a solid longsword attack. They've got a bunch of javelins. They don't throw with the most accuracy, but they throw a lot of them, so they're able to deal some damage. And they've got this colossal charge bonus of 22. And so this means that they will deal a lot of impact in the initial few seconds of the melee. Because the way infantry charges work in Rome Total War, the infantry get the charge bonus for the first few seconds of the melee, since sometimes the charging infantry themselves bug out a little bit, or pause slightly short of the enemy lines. But yeah, and this reflects the classical author's notes that the Celts were very vicious in the charge, but would perhaps tire or not perform as well as in the extended melee. I didn't see a need to give them a stamina reduction to deal with this, because stamina has a lot of other effects that that perhaps would be tough to account for. Also, you have to run your troops around, etc., and it's not like these guys are terrible at running. Most infantry baseline will have good stamina in this for balance purposes. But just because they don't have great defenses, they will naturally just not perform super well in a longer melee. And so there's no need to give them a morale penalty or stamina penalty or anything to account for that. You can contrast the Botros here, I suppose, with the Batoros, who they have 2 more defenses from better armor at a cost of some defense skill. But they also have they've been given a trait that makes them hardier and have tougher morale. So this means that they have 12 morale instead of 11, they have very good stamina instead of good stamina, and they have a bit more defenses. but you're paying 350 more for them. But you really are getting a unit that, it may just look like 2 defense, if you just look at the raw stats, but the additional morale and stamina means these guys will last a lot longer in a combat fight. The Gyros here, another example of a classic Celtic unit here. These guys have been given a spear trait, which gives their spear more lethality in exchange for less and better charge in exchange for less defense. This trait's also been given to some of the hoplite units, which already have amazing defenses, to give them a bit more punching power in melee as well. We'll revisit those in another video. But these guys have sort of the most extreme of the charge bonuses. They got a huge charge bonus of 26. And they've got that slightly higher lethality, not as high as a sword, but still pretty good, so they'll be able to pack a real punch. But they won't last super long in melee. You might contrast this with, say, the Batakuri, who don't have this. Instead, they've been given that hardiness trait, so they're really solid, long-lasting spearmen in a line, especially with that big shield that they have. Some of the Celt units don't have this necessarily. For example, the Arjos, because they're fighting in a tough, dense formation, they've had their charge bonus removed from them. They make up for this, of course, by just being great fighters. Great, sturdy, long combat fighters. And the same is true with the Solduros as well. So let's move on to the Swibbles. So unlike the Celts, similar to the Celts, I suppose, the Germans have they have an heavy infantry discount, but reflecting the fact that armor was rare among their people, and they didn't have as much access to metal, and they're relatively impoverished, armor costs more for the Swibbles, and they don't have a weapons discount. However, what they do have, instead of that big charge bonus, is they got high morale. They have +2 morale baseline on all their infantry, which is makes them quite a bit more resilient and able to outlast a lot of enemies, even if they do take more casualties. They'll hold up, they won't crack as easily. The iconic Germanic unit, the Dubunvies here, they sort of exemplify this. They've got, they don't have amazing defenses. They have the Framea, which another characteristic Germanic weapon. The Framea, Tacitus describes it as a long spear, relatively short actually, about 6 feet 2 meters or so, which was equally suited for throwing or melee engagement. So they got this big heavy spear they throw at the enemies. You can see they have a very good missile attack. They got this big heavy spear, and then they have this this very solid morale for holding up in melee. So it's really sort of makes the Swibbles play very interesting. They will deal a lot of they're able to weaken enemies significantly, and then they're able to fight for a while. Really have a lot of tenacity in the battle line. And this morale partly reflects historically how Germanic warriors hired by the Romans were noted for not just their ferocity, of course, but their loyalty and their sturdiness. And that's why they were often used as bodyguards. And so this is then they serve the Romans quite well. And so this Dubunvies unit has this, as do many other Germanic units. And we can highlight some of the variation among these war bands. The Dubunvies, they can be contrasted here with the Druchtis Holbugiska, who aren't quite as good with their javelin attack, but they have a big shield which will offer them more resilience to enemy missiles, and will help them fight a bit longer in a melee as well with better defense. And you can contrast them also with the Druchtis Godiska, who are given that hardiness trait, so you can see, and they've got the aggressive spear. So you can see they've got a good charge, not quite a Celtic level charge, but a good one with that lethal spear at the cost of some defensibility. And they have the hardiness trait that gives them very good stamina instead of good stamina, and the +1 morale. So these guys, they're a bit more specialized to be attack troops. You'll get them attacking the enemy line, and they don't have the most amazing stats, but they will last a while as very tough dudes charging at the enemy and then fighting on. And with the good stamina, they'll deal out damage for a while, especially with their higher spear lethality. So you can see there's a little interesting variation even among these basic spear units, not to mention the huge other range of Swibbles units. Of particular note, I suppose, are their cavalry and archers. The Swepos, they don't have amazing archers, but the ones they have access to are pretty solid. The Scudiones, they are a rather tough archer. They're not great, honestly. I mean, they have a self-bow, they have good accuracy, they don't come in very large numbers, and their bow doesn't deal a lot of damage at very long range. But you know, they're effective. They're huntsmen, marksmen, levies, and you know they spent a very long time in the wilderness. They're very tough men, so they all have a bit more staying power in melee than most archers. But they won't deal the most damage because of their lower numbers, even though they have good accuracy. The Lunkinikos, they have a weapon we find later evidence of in the Baltic region, the longbow, which we later inference the Viking longbow. In the Viking Age, these longbows were often protected by Goritoi of clear steppe influence. We don't think the same steppe influence quite permeated the Balts this far, but these, you know, they still have a solid bow like they do in EB, and so these guys have longer range, they have decent accuracy, not great, but one of the best archer units you'll have access to is them, and they'll also like be quite tough to rout compared to a lot of other lightly armored archers. And of course the Medienikos, the Baltic frontiersmen. These guys, they're one of the few elite accuracy archers in the game. They have the same longbow. They're quite tough, you know, they have quite good morale. They have, you know, good missile range, and you know they'll still fold between decent against decent infantry in combat or a bunch of good cavalry, but you won't be able to just run them off. And for the cavalry, the Ridones, they're quite deadly because they have the same frame as the infantry. So between their pretty good accuracy and then carrying 4 different javelins, they may not have a lot of javelins compared to skirmish cavalry, but they will deal a lot of damage with them really quickly. And so this makes them quite ideally suited to quickly roughening up an enemy and then closing in for melee. And you can't hit unbroken enemies with these men. They've got mediocre defenses, and you know, better than a lot of other light horsemen, but they'll still rout for their cost. But they've got the overhand spear. They've got a solid attack value, and they'll fight quite well. The Kelto Germanic cavalry are sort of a more enhanced version of this. Of course, they have long swords instead. They've got great melee abilities. Not the most amazing defenses, but solid ones, and they got 5 Framei, so they will deal a lot of damage. These can be contrasted in a way with the Korepos, who, you know, the Gallic-like cavalry, got some okay armor. They've got a lot of javelins. They're much more useful as melee troops than many other skirmish cavalry because they've got that underhand spear, which they are solid at charging with. But they're really more of they're quite a good hybrid unit. But you know, they aren't. They're a bit more flexible, I would say, than the Redones. The Redones, you know, you see their much higher missile attack. They'll deal out that damage, they'll deal it out quickly, and then they want to pick a good fight soon after. Whereas the Korepos, they can last a bit longer and be operant for a while. I can look at the Casa next. The Casa, they are very much reliant on their champion units. The Casa, reflecting historical description to the Britons, they're a bit resource poor, although connected to the broader Celtic world. They have some access to good imports from the continent, and many of them are decently wealthy from engaging in the tin trade for a while. So they're sort of intermediate between the Celts and Germans in terms of bonuses. They get a +1 morale bonus, they don't get the same level of charge bonus, and they don't have nearly as many discounts to weapons and everything. The Britannics do at least. And the Casa, they have, of course, just like in base EB, they're quite reliant on these champions. Some of the more numerous ones being the Kumir and the Kalaure, quite solid infantry units. Which carry eagles, so they're able to inspire nearby men. you can still see they have quite powerful charge values. The more expensive ones being the Clodargus and the Cavalry. And of course, you also have a bunch of quite solid mainline spear units, which should not be overlooked. The Siluri Bernai are quite interesting because they throw a bunch of javelins at quite long range, as opposed to most Celtic javelins that have a slightly lower javelin number, better javelin attack, higher javelin attack, same accuracy at a closer range. So they have that, but they also fight in a relatively dense formation, so they're quite unique. At Kemenern, who are relatively similar to some of the bigger shielded troops we've seen. Some good skirmish units, especially the Bolroi, who have good, solid accuracy at decent range, but they're also not potatoes in melee fights. Not great in melee fights, but they're still more useful, and they've got, great stamina, high morale, so they'll put about a better fight than most skirmishers. Standard access to archers and stuff. Cavalry's crap. Chariots, we're still working on figuring out the balance there. But yeah, that's the Casa for you. And of course, they're the only Celtic faction with access to druids with the chanting ability. Lusitana is next. Iberians, they have a very steep discount to weapons and a slight discount to armor because of the abundance of metals in the Iberian Peninsula. The Romans mined them extensively. And they have discounts to horses as well, reflecting the good horse breeding grounds of the region and the historic high quality of its cavalry, especially as heavily recruited by the Romans and the Carthaginians. And so you see this in their quite good, solid diversity of cavalry units for a faction this size. You have everything from the Cantabre Poneredum, the only the only cheap skirmisher cav with very good accuracy, very highly effective skirmishers. Not the greatest in melee. You only want to use them to support a little bit for that role. Contrasted, of course, with the Equites Caetrati, who are less expensive. They have good accuracy, not very good accuracy, a little more melee resilience. The Iberi Lanceari, they've been changed a bit from base EB. They don't have this mailed horse anymore. Instead, what they are is, I think, one of the very few elite cavalry units that has very good stamina, like the Moroso Nagema. They have, of course, they're a one-handed lance unit instead of two-handed lance. And they have a shield. So they are probably one of probably the hardiest heavy cavalry unit in the game in that respect. They will be able to take a lot of their lance charges. They aren't super powerful. They're still quite good, but they can take a lot of different fights. They have some solid melee resilience. They have some protection from missiles thanks to the shield, and they're very good stamina and superb morale. 17, base delete is 16, but just that little bit more means they're just reliable to fight to the end and take a lot of fights for you. Same thing with the interesting Ambacro Epones, 12 javelins, very good accuracy. You don't want to mess with these guys dealing damage to you. You just want to be careful because they aren't as well armored as a lot of other league cavalry, but use them well and they will deal some massive pain. And for the more basic infantry, you have things like the Caetrati, who they have Solifera, so Solifera, like Pila, have an accuracy bonus because they were typically, their ballistics were quite good for throwing. They typically have a lead weight near the top, so they would fall better towards their enemies. And so between that and the massive attack value on their javelins, these guys will deal a ton of damage. And of course, they have very good stamina and solid morale, so they'll be quite resilient in a melee, even if they perhaps aren't the best armored. So, and they have a falcata, which is suited to chopping. So they will, they have quite good attack. Their defenses aren't the greatest, but they will last a while, and they have great stamina. The same can be said of the Scutari, who, you pay a pretty penny for them, 1793 against, say, 1600 or so for a typical Turiaforo unit, and you get less defenses. But you have the Solifera dealing a lot of damage, you have better morale, and you got that very good stamina, so overall you're getting something that's worth it. And for some of the other Iberian units, you have a lot of these, heavier regional infantries from the north that are all quite useful. in their own way. You have this Kortamareva, Dunaminaka, other units of that sort. And you have a bunch of these javelin units that are quite good. And yeah, you want to make use of these just to harass the enemy and slow them down and provide melee support. And while you don't have any archers, you do have Balearic slingers, who are just absolute murderers. Absolute murderers, these guys. Don't mess with them. And last but not least, we have the Getai. Very interesting and flexible faction. A historic favorite for EB players. They've got, Fulakis, Daoi. They've got this relatively small selection of heavy cavalry, but still quite decent. They have the excellent Mezanayan Traikyo Hipeis, solid skirmisher cav, very good horse archers with, quite a bit more expensive than the steppe counterparts, but they have very good accuracy, which is quite important for hitting a missile duel range. And they're the only European factions that, besides the Soromatai, I guess, that consistently have recurve composite bows. So the Komatai Toksotai are just going to be much better than most similar archers, with their very long range and good attacks. The Komatai Agrianai, same story. These are, again, one of the few elite archers in the game. So they've got a great attack, great range, deal out a ton of pain to their enemies. And of course, the Getai, they have their iconic Foxmen, low defense, highly effective at chopping through enemies. Same thing with Zonopaya Foroi, although they're better armored. They've got they've got some decent line units, like the Torakita Stratiotai, the Getikoi Stratiotai. The Dacians, they have high morale, like the Germans, and they have, in addition to high morale, they don't have the same weapons and infantry discounts as the other barbarian factions, but they do have a discount to missile ability. A lot of them fought more lightly and at range. So you can see that you're paying about the same for these Komatai Toksotai as you pay for Sotaros, but these guys just way better. Komatai, quite a cheap unit for what they're able to pull off. 6 javelins, 12 morale from that Getai Dacian bonus to morale from the religiosity. It means these guys will fight a lot better than most skirmishers with their Sikai in a fight. Of course, the Traikoi Peltastai are going to be these guys are expensive mercenaries, but they deal a ton of damage at long range with their very good accurate javelins. Got great morale and defense abilities, so they're able to take a melee fight as well. Yeah, just overall, the Dacians are perhaps one of the most flexible factions out there. I suppose, if anything, the one thing they may lack is a sword unit, a solid line sword unit, but you can compensate by, say, using Boiking Getos, or maybe perhaps using some of these units, the Taxes Tribuloi or the Herunoduzes, or even you can use the Komatai Epilectoi to stand your line when you need to. These guys are solid swordsmen as well. Or even in a pinch, you could switch your Dacian Light Phalanx out of guard mode and have them use their Sikai to fight in the main line. And perhaps they lack a bit in heavy cavalry options, but the ones they have are still quite solid. Perhaps they won't take a good fight against enemy elite cavalry in melee, so you need to plan around that. So anyways, that's the Getai for you. The Getai. So that should cover all the major barbarian factions in EB, or the major European barbarian groups, and how we're trying to make them all feel quite unique, but in terms of bonuses. Just like, rather than having like generic barbarian bonuses, we have these cultural specific bonuses and penalties that are hopefully accentuating the uniqueness of each of these factions and how they play out in very specific ways. And so hopefully players will be able to craft strategies around this. Perhaps with the Celts, you want to find a way to use. You have all these cheaper units, of course, but you really want to find a way to use those charges to maximum effect and fight like the historic Celts did. Deal a bunch of initial damage and the shock, and translate this to a permanent victory by figuring out a way to really push through the enemy lines and kill a bunch of them. With the Germans, the Swivels, you're gonna want to deal a lot of damage with the Framei effectively before you close in for the melee, because your main weakness is that your troops, they may last a while, but they're lightly armored, and so better armored enemies will get the better of them, especially initially in the combat. And so you want to weaken them enough and then outlast them, or perhaps provide an opportunity for some of your more aggressive units, like the Slochones, or some of the fear-inducing infantry, or maybe your cavalry, to get a good engagement as your hardy infantry buy you time. The Lusotana, they want to play as a mobile skirmisher faction, reduce the enemy's numbers so that your hardy light, similar to the Swivels, is reduce the enemy's numbers so that your hardy light troops can take a good fight. Although the way they do that is not quite the same as the Swivels is. They have rather than these powerful infantry javelins, they have a lot of lighter skirmish javelins, and they have a few more options for armored troops, but they don't have the same options for fear-causing or specialist infantry. And with the Casa, you were very reliant on those champions to really bolster your the ranks of your light men as they fight. You'll probably be reliant on druids and/or chariots as well. A very old-fashioned army you have there. And the Getai, they're extremely flexible faction, able to fight well at range, and also field a solid range of light to medium and a small number of heavy melee infantry, and some great cavalry as well. So incredibly flexible faction there, with high morale in their light troops, just like a lot of these other barbarian factions. So they'll be able to, they don't have quite the same costs bonuses that the other barbarians do, but they'll still able to take quite an efficient fight for a long time with these light men, as they bring in foxmen, cavalrymen, archers to deal with the enemy from various angles. So yeah, hopefully this is a useful summary about what's going on in this new system, and I'll plan to do this a bit more with some of the other factions in the future. I may cover the steppe factions, I may cover the Persianate factions, I may cover the successors, I may cover the Saba, very unique faction,